Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago UN campus in Hong Kong. Welcome to our program this evening. Tonight, we'll continue our Director's Pick series with the new mini-series, Socially Disconnected, The Trend Toward Loneliness. Our UChicago faculty member will discuss how loneliness can alter the brain from a neuroscience perspective and what we can do to feel more personally connected in today's world. In upcoming programs, we'll expand on this topic by looking at other aspects of psychology and neuroscience to help understand the brain and manage mental health. If audience members have questions to submit this evening, you can do so through the questions and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit the UN campus website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest UChicago UN programs, activities, and events. You can also follow the UChicago UN campus on Facebook, Instagram, and many of the other social media platforms. We'll wrap up tonight's program with a poll and more information about upcoming events you may be interested in, so be sure to stay until the very end. Let's start tonight with a brief introduction of our speaker. Professor Greg Norman joined the faculty at the University of Chicago in 2012 as an assistant professor of psychology with a secondary appointment in psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience. Professor Norman received bachelor's degrees in psychology and philosophy from The Ohio State University in 2007. He entered graduate school at Ohio State, where he worked in laboratories of A. Courtney DeVries and Gary G. Bernstein, and received his PhD in psychology with a specialization in behavioral neuroscience in 2010. Professor Norman's graduate research primarily focused on understanding the physiological process underlying the relationship between social interaction and health outcomes using both animal models and human participants. Following graduate school, Professor Norman worked as a postdoctoral research scholar in the laboratory of John T. Cacioppo and the University of Chicago, where he continued his research in the field of social neuroscience. Professor Norman, thank you so much for joining us tonight. In our conversations that we've had leading up to this, I am so excited and delighted that you've been able to join us. So I'll hand the stage over to you so that you can begin your lecture.
All right, thank you very much for that very kind intro. Hopefully I can meet the standards of your excitement there. So. All right, so just very quickly about what the kind of goals of what I'm going to discuss today. I'm going to talk about loneliness and the socially disconnected within a kind of larger framework of stress research, with a particular emphasis on understanding what are the mechanisms that lead individuals to become lonely, what are the differences between things like loneliness and social isolation, and how does loneliness manifest with regards to how individuals respond to stressors. I'm also I'm a notorious fast talker, so I'm going to try to slow down as much as possible. But if I get carried away, please, anyone on the panel, feel free to shut me down a little bit. All right, so given to the topic, it makes sense that the first thing we want to do here is define what we mean by loneliness. So here, I'll let you read this definition. And one of the things that kind of jump out immediately is when we're talking about loneliness, we're specifically talking about how an individual feels or perceives their relation to the social world. So this isn't a function of just counting how many Facebook friends you have or how many likes you have, right? This is about, at some level, your qualitative assessment about how many friends you want, what sort of relationships you would like, what you have, and then the difference between those two. And as I mentioned here, really loneliness tends to occur when we have a difference between what we want and what we have. So myself, I might, kind of in a very simplistic situation here, I might like to have 5 friends and I only have 3, right? That's likely to generate a loneliness response. Whereas yourself, you might like 10 friends and you have 9, right? So it doesn't necessarily, and that's going to make you lonely, so that you might reconnect, right? So it doesn't, with regards to loneliness, it doesn't matter how many friends you have per se. It's more about what you require, what your needs are, and what you actually have. And when there's a mismatch between those two, that tends to give rise to loneliness. And so when an individual feels lonely, some of the things that tend to happen is they have a strong desire. They're motivated to reconnect with a social group. So as we say here, they're motivated to maybe go out with friends more, make new friends, reach out to other individuals. And in many cases, loneliness happens involuntarily, right? No one really signs themselves up to be lonely on purpose. It's something that kind of occurs once our brain recognizes it. It tends to drive a response to try to remedy the situation. We can contrast loneliness with how we define it there with this ideal of social isolation. So they're very, very similar, right, in a lot of ways, but they're different in very important ways that we're going to discuss today. So when we think of social isolation, fundamentally that boils down to just quantitative assessment of things like how many friends, how many social contacts have you had, say, in the past week, right? It's not really taking into account your what your needs are and that sort of mismatch. It's just a tally of how many interactions you have. It's also the case that social isolation isn't necessarily involuntary, right? So, if you're anything like me, sometimes it's fantastic when you have an opportunity to kind of, at some level, have some solitude, maybe to think or to study. And when we do that on purpose, that can be healthy, right? So just because somebody's socially isolated, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be lonely. The flip side of that, which is at some level, to me, it's something I nerd out about quite frequently, is when you're lonely, in many cases, you can be more lonely when you're around a bunch of individuals, right? So at some level, being alone in a crowd is something that we can experience with this definition here. And in fact, as we've all experienced loneliness, sometimes when you're lonely and you're around a bunch of other individuals that look like they're having a good time, that can make you feel even worse, right? So even though these two constructs are similar, what we want to do is certainly separate them and think of them as having different mechanisms and different impacts on things like mental health as well as physical health. So when we're primarily focusing on loneliness, in a lot of ways, what we're talking about is the stress response associated with that mismatch between your desired number and quality of contacts and what you actually have. And so thinking about stress generally, which we're going to kind of use as a framework throughout this lecture today to kind of help make sense of what loneliness is, here we have the standard definitions that we can think of when we're talking about stress in this context. And in this case here, we have this very generic definition, which a response of a system to any demand for change. We have the stressor, which is the thing that causes that imbalance or that demand. And then we have a stress response, which is how an organism, how an individual responds to that stressor. The important thing we want to keep in mind here is stress itself isn't really a psychological phenomenon. We might say, I'm feeling stressed or I'm stressed out about something, but fundamentally, when we're talking about stress in the kind of scientific context here, really emotions are what connect the stressor to the stress response. One emotion that's relevant for today is loneliness, right? So in the context we've been talking about here, that stress responses associated with loneliness are associated with kind of having that mismatch between your desired quality and number of friends and what you actually have is being driven by loneliness. Another example that we can, or at least I'm very familiar with at the moment, is an example being public speaking, right? I'm sitting in front of a very large number of brilliant individuals. That's very stressful. And so when we think about these constructs, for me at least, the stressor is worrying about, in that case, about how you'll think about, what I'm saying, whether you'll believe it, or you think I'm, full of junk or anything along those lines. And the stress response is how I'm trying to cope with that sort of stressor. So I'm going to go through this very briefly, but the important part I'm going to talk about these stress response systems is to give an idea that really everything that we're thinking about here, so the way that we respond to particular stressors, those emotions that I just talked about, have an impact on just about every single system of the body. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the stress response systems that allow that to happen. So in the case of myself here doing a public speech, being very fearful, it stands to reason that what's going to happen is I'm going to initiate a kind of a hormonal stress response here. And this is going to be mediated by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It doesn't matter if you never hear that again, but the important part here is this is one of the mechanisms through which mental processes are able to affect physiological processes, primarily through the release of one of the more important stress-related hormones, cortisol. So the fact that I'm feeling a mild to moderate amount of fear at the moment is very likely giving rise to cortisol going higher in my bloodstream, which is getting into just about every single cell of the body and changing the way that cell operates. Now, initially that sounds a little scary, but what we want to keep in mind is for the most part, stress is good. I'm going to talk about that here throughout the lecture, but in many of these cases, this is how organisms adapt and respond to stressors. Another system, one of the things that I study in my lab primarily is the autonomic nervous system. This is the hardwired system that connects your brain to about every single organ in the body. So things like feeling lonely, fearful, anxious, also joy, happiness, contentment, all of those psychological phenomena are, fundamentally, structurally connected to these stress response systems. And they're, again, changing the way those peripheral responses activate as a function of how we're perceiving and responding to stressors. And then finally, another stress response system that I'm going to touch on today is the immune system, right? So the immune system, in addition to doing its thing with regards to protecting us from COVID, right, it's in constant contact with the brain. So same story here, the same sort of emotional states that I've been talking about with regards to fear are impacting the way that your immune system is operating. And just to give a couple of the mechanisms, we already talked about the HPA axis. That's in constant communication with the immune system, as well as both branches of the autonomic nervous system. So the important part here is we have a very good understanding of what the mechanisms are now that allow mental processes and their underlying neural mechanisms to give rise to very large and profound changes into the periphery. And many of these systems that I just talked about here are the primary mechanisms that something like the way that I'm perceiving my social environment can actually get under the skin and affect health outcomes, affect how my organs are operating. Another one we just can't really leave out too much, especially as a psychologist, emotions and behavior are also stress response systems that we're going to be talking about really throughout this entire lecture. All right, so when we're thinking about stress, sometimes it's much easier to make sense of it when we're trying to put it into a more simplified model. So I'm guessing many of you have heard of this idea of homeostasis. I'm just going to very briefly go through it. And so homeostasis is this ideal of physiological systems trying to maintain a relatively constant internal environment in the presence of a constantly changing external environment, right? So one example here is if you look at the set point here, that's what, in this case, what your body wants your temperature to be in this sort of framework. So we might imagine that the set point for body temperature could be something like 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And we have sensors in place that when we deviate from that set point, we can either increase the amount of heat of our body or decrease through things like sweating, right? To try to maintain that set point. So this sort of process here, that we have sensors detecting the set point and then systems in place to move around body temperature to try to maintain that set point is the idea of homeostasis. We can also think of homeostatic processes in the context of things like hunger, right? When an individual is, we can think of a really simplistic version, like maybe low blood sugar or something associated with not eating, right? That's going to motivate that individual to go out and probably not forage. I mean, that's like 200 years ago. Forage for me means go in the line to go to McDonald's or something. So I will be now more motivated to go get food to try to get back to that set point or that kind of no longer needing nutrients, right? So this is just another example of how this homeostatic framework can help explain behaviors. And what I'm going to be arguing for today, in some level, what we're talking about is a deviation from that homeostatic set point in the context of loneliness, right? So as I mentioned before, everyone has a different, at some level, set point for the quantity and quality of our social relationships, right? When we deviate from that, when we detect that we don't have that quantity or quality that we need, homeostasis is not maintained, right? And what tends to happen is emotions like loneliness kick in to try to get that individual back to their set point, just like we talked about with body temperature, right? So loneliness fundamentally is very similar to hunger, right? For the most part, if you're feeling satisfied with your social relationships, you don't feel it, much like if you just ate a large meal, you're not hungry, right? Hunger is there, and it's, many times unpleasant to get you back to that set point, just like loneliness in many cases serves to help an individual who's not at that set point get back to it by motivating them to reconnect with their social environment. Another thing I want to point out, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are the negative consequences of loneliness. And the last thing I think the world needs at this moment, given the past couple of years, is more stress about stressing. I mean, meta stress is a whole nother level of stuff we don't want to worry about here. But for the most part, acute stressors that don't go on weeks to months to years, right? Things that, standard run-of-the-mill stressors, they're good. But the way we tend to think about stress, and many times the way we're taught about it, is to think of it at some level like this sort of model here, where the optimum amount of stress is the lowest amount possible, right? And this sort of idea, any amount of stress is bad, right? This is at some level kind of how we're taught about it, certainly how we talk about stress. But what we have an enormous amount of evidence for is that's not actually how the stress responses work in this case. In many cases, stress responses, and actually in most cases, stress responses are good. And so this is this inverted U model When we have stress on the x-axis, so we have low on the left-hand side, high levels of stress on the right-hand side, and on the y-axis here, we have performance, but we could think of positive health outcomes here as well. And what we tend to see is that too little or not enough stress can be very bad, right? A really easy example of this is not exercising, right? Exercise is a form of physical stress, right? We go out and we stress our body and cause micro tears that heal, right? But not exercising, that lack of stress, we know has negative consequences. And the same is true in many ways for psychological stress. So on the left-hand side of this, way on the left-hand side, too little stress is bad. And on the far right-hand side, as we're going to talk about here, we all know this, way too much stress is bad. But one thing we want to keep in mind is that mild to moderate amount of stress is optimal for performance, things like test taking, at some level, that adrenaline rush you need to go interact with new individuals. This is an optimum situation to where a non-zero amount of stress is actually the healthiest amount. So when we're thinking about, the really bad negative consequences of things like chronic loneliness, I want to just point out what we're principally talking about is far on the right-hand side. For the most part, all of us experience loneliness pretty frequently, and it is, in many cases, healthy, right? It's a good thing. It's just like hunger. It might not be pleasant when we experience it, but it helps get us back to that set point. So the important part to take out of here is that fundamentally stress isn't bad. It's far more complicated than that. And in most situations, some mild to moderate amount of stress actually makes us better. Another thing we want to keep in mind, especially for what we're going to be talking about today, is if we want to understand stress, if we want to understand how do people respond to it so differently, how do we respond to all the different stressors out there, what we have to take into account is perception. The way that particular individual evaluates that particular situation they're in is what determines the stress response. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter if I think somebody should be stressed or if you think they should be stressed. It matters how they're perceiving that situation, right? That's what dictates and that's what generates the stress responses. So we can't think of objective stressors in the environment and try to act like that's going to actually be able to explain all of the data that we have in the literature. If we want to explain the complexity of the stress response, we have to take into account the perception of that individual or even the non-human animal. Just a really quick, somewhat silly example of work that was done in the late 60s and 70s to kind of demonstrate that it's not just about the objective amount of stress or stressor an organism's experience, about the way they perceive it is what generates a stress response. It's work done. And back in the 60s and 70s, apparently, if you wanted to stress animals out, you just shock them. So that's how most of these ended up going. So I named these silly animals here, Sarah and Jane. The important part is both of these animals are in identical cages. They have electrified grids on the floor. And both of the animals' cages are connected to an electrical generator. So when the shock turns on, it's always the case that Sarah and Jane get the same amount of shock, right? So that same amount of a stressor is occurring to both animals. And if perception didn't matter, you would expect that no matter what, they're going to have the same stress response. However, researchers found that if you gave one of the animals the ability to shut off that shock, right? So they can hit a lever, the shock turns on, they hit a lever and it turns off their exposure to shock. Importantly, it's also going to turn off the shock to the other animal, the Jane animal in this case, but the Jane animal doesn't know that, right? From the perspective of the Jane mouse here, it's just randomly happening. The Sarah animal in this case knows that when the shock turns on, it can turn it off. And what the researchers repeatedly found in these sorts of studies over and over and over, not just in mice, not just in dogs, in humans, and just about every animal, certainly every mammal that we've cared to study, what we see is the animals that perceive they can't control their exposure to a stressor has a much higher stress response than the animals who perceive they do. So in this case, what we're seeing here is it doesn't necessarily matter that both animals receive the identical amount of stress or a stressor in this case. What matters is how they contextualize and perceive that stress, and that's what dictated their stress response. All right, another important point, I know we're jamming a lot of information here, but hopefully it'll help make loneliness a little bit more clear here. One of the things that tend to happen with the emotions associated with stress, and we've all experienced this as well, is it changes the way we perceive stimuli. So for myself, I skipped breakfast this morning, big mistake. I can promise you any smell of any food now, it smells like the greatest thing I've ever smelled, right? When you're hungry, food smells better. Things look tastier, right? That's fundamentally what the role of emotions are. They're there to bias us to achieve a goal. In this case, when we're thinking about hunger, it's to get that food, right? The more hungry we get, the more deviated we are from that set point, the more motivation we have to go do something about it. I'm just going to quickly go over some work on the right-hand side, kind of demonstrating this. This is work done in rats, where typically what we see here is that on the baseline, what we have right here, is that rats prefer sugar water to salt water. That's not that surprising. On the y-axis, we have normalized firing rate. This is in a structure in the brain that codes for reward, but this could also be how much they like that particular stimulus, right? So under baseline conditions, animals will always pick sucrose over salt solutions. However, if you deplete these rats of sodium so they don't have salt, and then you put them in the same situation where they get to choose, all of a sudden that salt water to them tastes even better than the sugar water, right? Principally because they had a need, right? There was a deviation from the amount of sodium they needed in their body. Their brain detected that, and now all of a sudden it made any sort of stimuli associated with sodium far more rewarding. This is what emotions are supposed to be doing, right? They're supposed to bias us to make it more likely that we achieve a goal. In this case, the achieving of a goal would be getting more salt in our diet. The same story that we're talking about here happens with loneliness. When you're lonely, you see the world differently than when you're not lonely. All the kind of cognitive and affective biases in place there are aimed at, in the short term, getting us to reconnect with our social group. Another thing if we want to try to explain how does loneliness go from something that might be helpful to something that might be maladaptive, another big factor in stress research is appraisal, the way you appraise a particular situation. So one example that we've all experienced, you have a big test coming up, maybe a standardized test or a big test in your class. You know it's going to be difficult, but you think you have what it takes to, if you study really hard, if you use appropriate coping mechanisms, that you'll be fine, right? So it's still stressful, but you think you can do it. You think you have control over at least some aspects of your performance, right? That, even though it's still stressful, that is something we want to call a challenge appraisal, a challenge response, right? This is typically that sort of optimum amount of stress. This is usually a good sort of stress response. However, if you're anything like me, you've also experienced the inverse of that, right? Where you have some tests where you're pretty sure, at least in your own perception, that there's nothing you can do. It doesn't matter how much you study. You just don't think you have the necessary resources to meet that demand of that particular test, right? And these situations, fundamentally, you could be right or wrong, but what determines how you respond to that, both behaviorally? Do you study hard? Do you, put the sort of effort and planning into, or do you just give up and quit? What determines that is your appraisal of your own resources and the demands of the task. So again here, what determines your stress response isn't some objective external factor. It's your own belief state about what you can do and the difficulty of the particular task. And those particular belief states here with the challenge response as well as the threat responses, the important part to get out of this, they give rise to very different flavors of stress reactivity. Importantly, it's that threat response, that kind of long-term increase in vascular activity. So blood pressure in this case is increasing because your blood vessels are being constricted. This is the sort of stress response in many cases that gives rise to maladaptive stress-related long-term health outcomes, right? So in many cases, that sort of constant perception that you don't necessarily have the resources to meet the demand gives rise to the type of stress response that we want to avoid as much as possible. The important part about this is in many ways, these appraisals are changeable. We can do something about them. It's not like we're just necessarily victims of this. These are things that we can work on and do something about. Another thing that those stress appraisals do is change how we cope with particular stressors. And one of the things I really want to emphasize here is sometimes we don't have, it's uncontrollable, unpredictable when the stressor occurs. But in a lot of situations, we do have control over how we cope with it. And if you get one thing out of this presentation, I would like it to be at the very least, the type of coping strategies we use is the biggest indicator of whether or not stress is going to be that optimal type or that maladaptive type. It's not necessarily just the exposure to something bad. Really what determines, whether it's good or bad, fundamentally from our perspective, is how we cope with it. So there's lots of different coping strategies, but I'll just carve out a couple of the more important ones. Probably the one that if we had to pick that we could use as much as possible are active coping strategies. We tend to use active coping strategies when we believe we have some level of control over situations, so more like the sort of challenge stress response. And so what we're trying to do is deal directly with the issue. So if you're feeling lonely and at some level you have that sort of a challenge response to it, you're much more likely to take active coping strategies to directly deal with the fact that you need to reconnect. Maybe you reach out to more friends, you try to reconnect with past friends, make new friends. You're taking active measures to address the problem. And in many cases, when things go wrong, it's when individuals overutilize passive coping strategies. This is basically, in a lot of ways, you use passive coping strategies when you don't feel like you have control over the situation. So you try to avoid even thinking about it, maybe use drugs or alcohol, or just kind of distract yourself from the primary problem. What you're trying to do is at some level is disengage. And in many situations, the passive coping strategies are the ones that give rise to those threat responses and the long-term negative health outcomes. So here, just kind of give some examples with the active coping. I mean, these are kind of somewhat silly, but you can certainly see here they're engaged, right? They're trying to do something about the problem, whereas passive coping strategies are more about disengagement or withdrawal from the problem. If we want to try to figure out how do you make stress go from something maladaptive to adaptive, or at some level from bad to good, it's using active coping strategies generally give rise to better stress-related outcomes, and particularly with regards to loneliness. So a particularly dangerous type of passive coping that does tend to occur in extreme cases of long-term loneliness is something called learned helplessness. So you might have already heard a little bit about this, but if you don't mind, I'll still use these poor little mice being shocked here to give a brief demonstration to those of you who haven't seen this or heard about it. What you have here is the same sort of situation. It's, back in the 60s and 70s, they really liked shocking animals back then. And you were looking at how animals cope with an uncontrollable stressor. So in this case, Ned is in this cage, and only half of its cage is electrified. Once that generator turns on, just the left-hand side of the cage is electrified, and it can jump over to the safe side, right? Pretty straightforward. That would be an active coping strategy. But what the researchers did is made it so that the animal cannot escape. So over long periods of time, the animal's exposed to a stressor that it simply cannot escape. It can't get away from. And what the researchers found is if you do that long enough, and even if you remove that barrier or even open the door to let the animal out, and when that shock turns on, they don't even try to escape anymore. At some level, they have learned that there's nothing they can do about it. And so they stop even seeking to try to take any sort of active coping measures. In many ways, this is exactly what happens in the context of that maladaptive loneliness that occurs over long periods of time, is when individuals have this sort of learned helplessness response where they kind of passively accept that this is how they are, and they don't try to do anything about it. And at some level, just like this animal here, you tend to stop seeing opportunities, or at least being able to pick up on available options to try to remedy the situation. And at some level, you just submit and just kind of give in. And so that's a coping strategy. It's something that's changeable, not necessarily easy, but it is something that's always changeable. Just a couple more examples of coping strategies, again, that fundamentally boil down to how we perceive a given stressor, are problem-based coping. So this is typically going to be under the active coping strategies. And again, we use problem-based coping strategies when we think we have control of a situation. So in the context of loneliness, a problem-based coping strategy would be utilizing resources like reaching out to friends, family, making new friends to try to do something about the problem. And again, that's contrasted with emotion-based coping, which we tend to use when we can't do anything about the situation. And in a lot of situations, at the very least, it's better to use that problem-based coping to deal with something like loneliness to try to help make sure it doesn't get into that very long-term chronic form. All right, so that's a little bit of kind of like a whole course worth of stuff on stress. So I'm sorry for blabbing too much about it. But going from just kind of maybe some boring big picture stuff regarding stress, one of the questions that probably fundamentally you're here for is trying to better understand, in particular, loneliness. But what are the things that we worry about the most, and what does that have to do with the topics we just talked about? So if we probably naively believe that humans were purely rational and we just paid attention to what we might think of as objective threats, we might predict that what humans worry about the most are things that you might see on this list. So this is just a list of standard causes of death in the United States here, with cardiovascular disease, cancer. You might expect that for humans, if we were perfectly rational, this is what we would be worried about. We would be very concerned with all of these things on this list, maybe car accidents, other factors that might relate to our death. But when you go and ask individuals what causes them the most stress in their life, what are they worried about the most, you end up repeatedly over and over and over getting a list that looks something like this, repeatedly over and over. And one of the things we're going to see here is very little of what's on that previous list is here, right? And if we go through this briefly, all of the variables that I've labeled red, those are clearly, at least I feel comfortable clearly labeling them as social in nature. right? And probably a lot of the ones that aren't labeled, we could give social as well. So it's kind of weird at some level to think that in many cases across the world, when you ask people what they stress about the most, what they worry about the most, they're social things. They're things having to do with our relationships. And the kind of neat and somewhat interesting thing is it's not even always bad, right? It's not, death of a spouse makes sense, divorce. But if you look at, say number 7 or 9, marriage, I think most people think of that as at least a temporarily good thing, right? I think of it as a generally good thing, but or things like pregnancy or gaining a new family member, these are generally good things, but there's still things that cause some of the most stress individuals experience. And one of the things I want to point out as to why, what helps us explain that, is we only have stress responses fundamentally about things that matter to us. So just because we have a stress response about something doesn't make it good or bad. At some level, that's telling us that the things we're having stress responses to are important to us and matter to us. So part of the reason why, in this case, the majority of factors that we tend to worry about the most, we tend to stress about the most, are social, is because for humans, a highly socially interdependent species, we need to connect to that group. So these things matter to us, which means we stress about them far more frequently. And so in larger studies, and again, I want to point out, this is only in chronic loneliness, right? This isn't that kind of acute loneliness we all experience. These are in much more extreme maladaptive situations. A number of studies have looked at what are the biggest predictors. In this case, I'm going to mention this study by Julian Holt-Lundstedt. What are the biggest predictors of mortality, right? So what we have on the x-axis here are effect sizes at some level predicting mortality. And and you can see here we have quality of social relationships, kind of different dimensions on the top 3. But we also have things like smoking, exercise, hypertension, and just to focus on the important parts here to kind of narrow it down, you can see here that the low quality individuals who report low quality social relationships, that is the biggest predictor of mortality, even when compared to things like activity, hypertension, and obesity, which we all know are very large risk factors. So again, this tells us that those things that we worry about, when that worry extends over very long periods of time, that has a direct impact on health outcomes, right? And it is a little bit surprising, again, that something like the way we perceive our social relationships is having this large of an impact. But if you keep in mind, fundamentally, our social relationships are what matters to us the most in the world. It's not that surprising that the biggest stressor that predicts at some level mortality as well as morbidity here is that perception of that low quality social relationship, that desire to reconnect and be a part of the social group. So that sort of work, that Julianne study was done maybe a decade ago, but sort of findings have been around since the 1980s. And the idea was something called the social control theory, where the belief was individuals who are maybe having low quality relationships, maybe they just live at home by themselves. They don't have family members coming to nag them to go to the doctor. Maybe they're not eating as healthy. They don't get enough exercise. But fundamentally, the idea there was what connects the social environment to health outcomes was just health behaviors, like how frequently do they see the doctor and how well do they eat, right? It didn't really have anything to do with what we're talking about here, that sort of psychological stress response. And so over decades, what people have done is try to directly test that. And so one sort of study here, what we have is a list of predictors of mortality. So not surprisingly, you have things like physical exercise here being a significant predictor of mortality. So that's not surprising, right? Smoking status, age, all of the things that you would predict that might be responsible for those health behaviors predict mortality, they are significant. But importantly, when you look at the effect of loneliness on that mortality outcome, even after controlling for all those health behaviors, what you find is loneliness still predicts mortality over and above those health behaviors, giving a very strong suggestion that the story can't be as simple as just changing in health behaviors. It has something more to do with the kind of stress response we have associated with these kind of maladaptive long-term states of loneliness. Also, we can study this in animal models as well, where we don't have to worry about, family members come over and take them to the doctor because we have vets that will come in every day. So this is an example of a study I did looking at fundamentally loneliness in animal models, where here what we just have is animals that were either pair housed for 14 days, so they had a friend in the cage with them, as compared to animals that were just socially isolated for 14 days. And what we wanted to look at is how does that social isolation and associated loneliness in this case, how does that predict how they respond to cardiac arrest and cerebral ischemia? So we looked at both 24 hours after the surgery as well as 7 days. And what we found here, you don't have to worry about these are just pro-inflammatory cytokines. They're indicators that the immune system is becoming at some level hyper-responsive to the injury. What we see, the important part here is that, oops, sorry about that, is that the isolated animals show much larger levels of pro-inflammatory gene expression in the brain as compared to the pair-housed animals. So what this means is that sort of emotional response, what I'm comfortable calling loneliness, associated with that long-term social isolation, is changing the way that immune cells are expressing genes in the brain, right? So connecting all the way to how these animals are thinking about their social environment is changing the way that their immune cells are active. In addition, if you look at the animals, this is kind of a good visual here. If you look at the socially isolated animals here compared to the pair house, that top bar is looking at dead or dying neurons in the hippocampus, a particular part of the brain. And what we see here is those dots, those particular green dots, those are the dead or dying neurons. So you can see here that animals exposed to just that social isolation, experimental manipulation, have considerably 3 to 5 times more cell death in this brain structure as the pair-housed animals. And here, looking at that inflammatory response, you see the same sort of story, which it gets at this idea, again, that it's not just the behaviors themselves, it's that psychological stress response to just being not connected with the group over long periods of time, for a mouse in this case, having profound impacts on the way that fundamental physiology is occurring. So what this tells us is that the story about how our social environment can get under the skin and impact health outcomes is far more complicated than just health behaviors. What we have to take into account is the psychological perception and the evaluation of those sort of phenomena, how that drives those stress response systems that I mentioned earlier, the autonomic nervous system, hormonal system, the HPA axis, as well as the immune system. And that's how, in many cases, health is impacted. So it's through this psychophysiological mechanism that gives rise to these outcomes, which means if we want to treat things like the profound impact that low quality social relationships have on health outcomes, we just can't pretend that the mental state and mental health issues of an individual don't matter. They're the thing that's driving this, right? So if we want to better understand how we can do better in cases of loneliness, how we can improve or help others, the very first place to start is with that mental health, whether it's improving our coping strategies or seeking out help from medical professionals. All right, so to kind of circle back a little bit, it's still, even though I've studied this for a long period of time and nerd out about it constantly, it's still a little bit surprising that just the lack of social companionship or lack of social interaction has such a big impact. So the question that we might ask is why, right? Part of the reason why is, and it's easy for us to forget this, is that we are highly socially interdependent species, right? In order for us to thrive as a species, we have to be very deeply connected with our social group, right? So that need to belong, that very strong drive to constantly be a part of that social group, maintain it at some level, is essential for human beings to thrive and certainly survive over long periods of time. And what loneliness is the aversive or the pain associated when we don't feel like we're meeting those needs, right? If the need to belong is just as essential at some level as eating and drinking, right? It makes sense that we have processes like loneliness to when we deviate from that set point and we're starting to get alarm signals that maybe we're not where we need to be with regards to our social network. We have systems in place that motivate to do something about it, right? That make it sufficiently uncomfortable that we are motivated to go try to do something about that situation and increase our motivation to connect with others. So just to kind of be a little bit silly here, but some of the reasons, again, why it's the loneliness or not belonging to a group is so impactful. Us humans, we like to pat ourselves in the back about we're the greatest, smartest species ever. But if you look at just any sort of, physicality or senses, we're horrible, right? So Usain Bolt, for example, he's the fastest human that's ever lived, right? He is just maybe as fast as a cat, right? A squirrel is only slightly less fast than our fastest human, right? So when it comes to the animal kingdom, right, we're not fast, we're not strong, our senses are weak, right? As an individual, we are not good. We are not good at surviving. It's only through that connection to that larger group that we're able to thrive and at some level dominate, right? So without that connection to the group, we are very, very weak. The squirrel there almost beating Usain Bolt. Another silly example that I always liked as well, probably staying up too late at 2 a.m. and watching this show called Alone over here in the States, which is still kind of silly for the same reasons. We take the best survivalists that we can find, we send them out into the woods by themselves, and the person who lasts the longest wins something like $500,000, right? So you got to remember, these are the best at surviving alone out in the wild. They make it a month or two, right? And they're given everything they have to try to just survive for a month or two. That squirrel that we were just making, that's where he lives, right? Humans by themselves, at some level, even the best of us, aren't that good at surviving out in the wild that's where every other animal lives. So again, kind of pointing out that it's easy to forget what makes us powerful or strong is that connectedness. And when we're not connected to that group, we're actually quite weak, right? We're at risk. So not belonging to the group is actually a very risky thing from a big picture evolutionary perspective, which gives rise to this idea of why something like loneliness could have arisen to keep us connected to the group. It's the glue that keeps us a part of that group. So this idea that really, if we want to ask, like, why are humans successful, at least populating the world, at least we could agree on that, right? It's through our cooperation. It's not because of the individual. An individual human is not that good of a survival machine, right? By ourselves, we're very, very bad. It's only when we connect ourselves up into that almost superorganism level of context there that humans can really thrive and dominate. So again, what loneliness does is help us make sure we are connected to that larger social world. So this is partially why, one, every single person listening to this has experienced loneliness quite frequently. If someone tells you they haven't, you can just smile, but everyone has. It's healthy. It's not a bad thing. It's how we kind of maintain those boundaries and make sure that we are connected to that larger social group. So when it happens acutely or transiently, it's just like hunger. It might be unpleasant, but it's a good thing. It's only when it goes on for long periods of time and we develop kind of maladaptive coping strategies that it becomes particularly bad. Just to point out, this isn't just a story about an isolated human being vulnerable, right? So here we have examples of a lion pride hunting water buffalo or wildebeest. I can never tell the difference. And the important part that we all kind of know is these lions hunt in it as a pack, right? The only way they're going to take down that much larger prey is if they work as a team, right? In addition to that, these animals here are being hunted. Being on the outside of the perimeter of that group is very dangerous. If they get isolated, if they get separated from the group, they're dead, right? That's the very first group of animals that the lions are going to go after. So for the predators here, if they're not part of a group, they're going to starve to death. For the most part, an alone lion here that's all by itself is going to starve to death. So it too needs to belong to its social group. It has to have those same motivations to cooperate and maintain its status within the group if it wants to survive. And at some level, if a lion needs to do that, it's not that surprising that humans do as well. Additionally, for the prey animals, belonging to that group makes it much more survival, makes it much more safe, right? As a group, these animals here, they could easily kill this isolated lion, right? So it's not just the prey, it's not just the predators. And in all of these situations, for animals that are socially interdependent, like humans, we have to belong to that group in order to survive, in order to thrive, and at some level over long periods of time in order to survive as well. Part of the reason why this is, again, so important and why humans at some level we can think of as being addicted to kind of this kind of social interaction, whether we like it or not, is this idea of the social brain. So one of the questions that individuals have been asking for a very long period of time is, why is it the case that in particular mammals and apes and very much particular humans, why do we have such a disproportionately large neocortex as compared to other species, right? One of the general ideas is that, well, first we have to point out that's not going to happen randomly. Like, brain tissue is extremely expensive, so it's very unlikely that it's just going to evolve for no reason at all. One of the primary, there's many of them, but one of the leading explanations for why organisms like humans have developed this very complex neocortex is to deal with the complexity associated with social networks. Right? When we take a step back and we think of all of our social connections, we have to remember past experiences. We have to know if friends are friends with each other. We have to, be loyal. We have to help people out. There's so many dynamics. We have to read people's emotions, right? That we have to track. That in order to keep up with that computation, the idea here is organisms have evolved this much higher order level of computation in the brain just to keep track of these social factors. So the idea here is the social world is so important to us that it's driven the development of these kind of overdeveloped brain structures. And some of the evidence for that, you've probably seen this sort of graph here. On the x-axis, we have neocortex ratio, which we can think of as the kind of neocortex divided by the rest of the brain or divided by body size. So the larger this number, the bigger the neocortex is in relation to other brain structures. And what we see is that organisms here that tend to have a higher neocortex ratio are also the organisms that have the larger group size and very likely the more complex social groupings, right? So with humans all the way up here. So the idea, again, is part of the reason we have this kind of overpowered brain that can let us do things like study black holes or work out, amazing mathematical theorems. The reason that brain developed, or at least one of them, is just to deal with the complexities associated with dealing with our social world here, with this sort of graph being at the very least consistent with that idea. All right, so to quickly try to tie as many of these things together as possible, when we're thinking about stress, any sort of psychological stressor we might experience, but in particular things like loneliness, again, we're talking about perception. It doesn't make sense to talk about objective threats in many cases and not take into account the perception of the individual, because as I mentioned earlier, in the context of loneliness, what might count as me feeling socially disconnected might be overwhelming to you, right? We all have our different set points, and our systems at some level are tuned to our set point. So it doesn't matter what your set point is with regards to my perception of this. So especially with regards to loneliness, it's all about how we perceive that sort of environment. Again, just to point out, because it's really important, the last thing we need is to kind of have a meta stress about loneliness. For the most part, not even for the most, everyone experiences loneliness, period. We all experience it all the time. It's not by itself bad, right? In many cases, mild to moderate loneliness over intermediate amounts of time is good. It's optimal. It increases our thriving, right? It's only when it becomes very long periods of time or very extreme that we get this kind of right-hand side of this inverted U. So we want to keep that in mind. Just because someone's experiencing loneliness doesn't mean it's bad. That could be a signal indicating that the individual might want to reach out and connect. It's not a signal to say, doom and gloom. It's just an indicator that we need to take advantage of our coping strategies to do something about it. And again, loneliness only becomes maladaptive when it goes unresolved for very long periods of time. And one of the primary ways that happens is this kind of vicious cycle where individuals kind of accept that they're, in many cases, it's not the only way, but they kind of accept that they're going to be lonely. They develop passive coping strategies. They almost expect to be rejected. And at some level, become not even motivated to try to reconnect. So it's that resignation that this is just who they are that tends to give rise to those long-term consequences, which means that's a problem with coping strategies, not necessarily a problem with loneliness. So when we start running into issues with stress generally, as I mentioned earlier, in particular loneliness, and they become maladaptive, in many cases, we want to keep in mind, it's the coping strategies that are maladaptive, and we can always do something about our coping strategies. Again, here, how we perceive that particular stressor is going to give rise to those coping strategies. And as I just mentioned, we can always adapt our coping strategies. There's always room for improvement. No matter how long we've been dealing with something, we can always improve. We can always seek out help, and we can always do something about it. And just to quickly touch on some approaches that individuals have taken to try to do something about loneliness, and this is becoming more and more relevant after COVID, which the whole world experienced. We were all alone together at some level with this, where you have societal level kind of reduction approaches or interventions, which is starting to get some traction, especially in the UK, where you're trying to educate individuals about what loneliness is, that it's not anything to be afraid of. It's certainly not anything to have stigma over, since we all experience it, and developing sort of government policies that try to do something, or at least educate individuals as what loneliness is and how we can do something about it. We have community level interventions where you're trying to kind of increase social connectedness in the community, integrate kind of built environments that allow it to make it a little bit more easier for us to go meet new people. And then on an individual level, there's been a lot more kind of success in interventions here, where things just as simple as going and seeing a therapist and talking about it. Going to cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective, because in many cases, one of the things you improve on are your coping strategies, social skills training, mindfulness, kind of relaxation, not kind of over meta stressing about stress. Some of the important part here is no matter what, no matter how bad it gets with regards to loneliness, there's always things we can do to make it better. It only becomes a problem when we kind of have that learned helplessness, resignation that there's nothing we can do about it. All right, I'm going to stop blabbing here, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Professor Norman, thank you so much. That was a lot of material to cover in a very short time. You did an excellent job of conveying a lot of material, but I still have questions. Good. And the audience has questions too. One of the last points you made was interesting to me. this idea of the fear of being rejected as a means of somebody becoming lonely. Is there also the idea that people push people away and that they create this wall around themselves, and so it's self-inflicted loneliness?
That's exactly right. And so to go back to what you're like at some level here, you're talking about that vicious cycle, and here was what you're discussing, where you have this behavioral confirmation process to where, because you already expect to be rejected, you aren't, like, the signals you're giving to everyone is that you don't care, you're uninterested, you're not putting any effort in, which it becomes at some level a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? When you're not trying to engage from the outside, what that looks like is you don't care, you're not trying to interact. And when you're in this vicious spiral here, what it tends to happen is that just confirms nobody wants to be your friend, you're never going to get out of this, right? But in many cases, that's primarily because you've already accepted that that's going to happen. And the way that you're dealing with that situation, you are close, you're not even giving people the opportunity to connect, right? And the other thing, kind of going off the first part, absolutely, people get rejected all the time. At some level, the kind of hyper fear response to that is also part of the problem. Every human being is going to get rejected all the time. And for the most part, we get over it very quickly, right? That uber fear of being rejected that causes us to avoid ever trying guarantees we'll be rejected, right? But, you know, the best, the most sociable and charismatic individuals, yeah, I mean, rejection's a little harsh, but there's lots of times on a probably weekly basis that they try to connect with people and they just get shut down. That's just part of the game, right? It's not an indicator that there's something wrong with us. I think you're muted.
That happened. I'm sorry. One really important area that we need to talk about and have you elaborate on a bit more is the impact of social media on our social interactions. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that could be like I'm certainly no expert on it, but you know, that's one of those two where we could spend months on that. And so if we circle back to what I was mentioning earlier, one of the things that dissociates loneliness from just what we might think of as objective social isolation is, in many cases, when you're lonely, it doesn't, and you're around people, that doesn't make it better. That could make it worse. If you're not connected with those people or you're not connecting with them, for the most part, all you're going to see, and if you remember loneliness being an emotion, it changes the way, it biases how we see the world. You're just going to start looking and seeing all the great connections other people have. And in many ways, it makes you feel even worse, right? And social media is that on steroids, right? Social media is where everyone logs in, we all self-present, right? Everyone, for the most part, only presents, some of my friends don't seem to do this very often, but for the most part, everyone else does, self-present like the best versions, right? And when you're feeling lonely and you get on social media and the only thing you see is happy people and great relationships, what we don't do is take a step back and go, of course, that's not the true story, right? Of course, things are more complicated. What we do is go, that's an indicator that there's something wrong with me, right? So social media at some level, and that kind of hyper kind of at some level kind of advertising of how great our lives are, when we're feeling lonely, that sort of fear of missing out, that sort of worry that other people are very, very happy and there's just something wrong with me, gets even worse. So social media doesn't create necessarily a new problem. It makes the old problem much, much worse.
Very interesting. You know, here in Hong Kong, we've had to deal with quarantine for a couple of years, more than a couple of years, to deal with COVID. And I don't want to make this program about COVID specifically, but
I think everyone's had enough of it, right?
Yeah, you and I have talked about solitary confinement, and last year I went through with my wife a 21-day hotel quarantine, and I would just wondering if you could speak to that. When I saw your mouse experiment with the paired mice versus the individual mice, I thought of myself and my wife, because originally I thought I would cope better if I were alone and able to focus in that quarantine environment. Turns out when we were together, we had each other to be social with, and I found that I was much better able to cope with quarantine under those circumstances. We had quarantine a few weeks ago in the same hotel. Maybe you'd like to share a little insight into this. The stress of being there over a couple days, even though we were together, made me feel like it was PTSD, made me feel like we went back to that same cell or that same environment, that same hotel with a beautiful view and a wonderful surrounding.
That's what I was about to say. If you think about it, that's really, it's not like solitary confinement in prison. I mean, it's a nice hotel. You're with a loved one. I mean, I think we didn't have that same sort of 21 day, but I think everyone that I know over here had a comparable sort of experience to where, for the most part, everyone thought this was going to be fine, right? Everyone thought, oh, this quarantine, great, I'm going to write 5 grants, do all these papers, because at some level we haven't had a societal wide thing happen to us to where we actually get a taste of what that sort of involuntary confinement, even if it's with loved ones. And I think for the most part, that's why we've had such just a burst of mental health issues. I think everyone now, whereas before they might have scoffed at something like loneliness, now realize like, whoa, that is the real deal. And so in your context, it makes sense that first time you experienced it, you went in with the kind of what you might think of a silly idea now, where if this is going to be fine, right? But after 21 days, even with a loved one, even in your home, realizing how tough that was, now you know, right? So the next time you do it, you're not coming in with these rosy colored glasses on. You're really concerned about what could happen. So that makes sense that you're going to have that kind of hyper response to a much more kind of habituated situation where it's only a couple days. Imagine how bad it would be if you were alone, right? That's the real
exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what went through my mind after we came out the first time.
And this is the same. This sort of problem is like space agencies have to deal with this, to where when you're sending someone to Mars or long distance space, people are going to be isolated, and at some level, that's one of the biggest hurdles for for any of these space stations to get through is, what do you do with these people, right? Because everyone thinks they'll be fine, but like your experience, a couple days in, even with a loved one, and we start becoming a little off the hinge a bit. And so when you're talking about doing that for years, that's just not a problem anyone solved at this point, and that's going to be a big problem.
Excellent. We have a question from an audience member who said, amazing presentation, Professor Norman. So I wanted to just give you kudos there.
I appreciate you leaving out all the bad ones, right?
Right.
Just focusing on the one good compliment.
There are none. How can we encourage people who experience loneliness for a long period of time and who automatically kind of shut themselves down, shut themselves off from people? How can we encourage those people to see a therapist, see some mental health expert?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be great if we just knew the specific. I think, a couple things to point out. One, the answer to that really is dependent upon the person, right? So some individuals you might, if you're really close with them, you could kind of peer pressure them to do it. But as we all know, plenty of other people to where they're not going to respond well to that. So I would say the very first step, especially if they're loved ones or people we care about, is just to reach out to them, right? Of keeping in mind that everyone, especially during times of COVID, is going through this. It doesn't matter how nice they look on the outside or how happy they look. Everyone's struggling. And so when you get wind of maybe one of your friends or family members or anyone really, you get a sense they're struggling more than usual or more than other individuals. The first step is just to talk with them about it. I mean, that might not be easy, but reach out, see if they're okay, see if they want to discuss it. In many cases, because we're all worried, we're all dealing with our own stuff. We don't reach out to other individuals. When you're in that cycle, from their perspective, what it tells us is no one cares, right? Even though, as friends, what we're doing is like the last thing we want to do is bother them or, we don't want to annoy them. But from their perspective, in many cases, that's just an indicator that no one's thinking about them. So, it's not getting them to a therapist is a big, at some level, that's a big goal that if you could make happen, that'd be great. But the first, I think the best approach is to focus on the first step, which is just reaching out to them, talking with them about it. And if you know them well, you'll at some level you have a sense of, are they going to be reluctant? How much you want to bring it up? But at the very least, just talking with them about it goes a long way in reaching that goal.
Fantastic. One question that came up as you were going through your presentation relates to the idea, because we have a lot of younger students generally that join our programs that want to learn from our expert UChicago faculty. The idea that that dealing with loneliness and dealing with stress gets more manageable with age. Do you have any data or research that you've done that suggests that when we're younger, we stress more and we are more lonely?
Yeah, so I think
there's the age we cope better.
Yeah, that's it. So you stole my thunder there. So yeah, I mean, if we want to, fundamentally, and this is hard to, on a large level, but yeah, when you're going to college and you're leaving your maybe you're leaving your family for the first time and going to a new place, that those sorts of situations, especially when you're younger, that tends to be the most lonely individuals, right? For a couple of reasons. One, that makes sense given what we talked about with loneliness. You're being disconnected from, you still have family and friends, but you're in a new environment where you don't have those connections. The goal of loneliness is to make them, right? To motivate you to make them, right? So I think if we keep in mind that, one, for the most part, in their early 20s, going to college or doing those sorts of things, yeah, that is probably the most intense loneliness individuals experience. And part of the reason we get better over time, the majority of the reason, is we learn how to cope with it better. We learn more effective coping strategies, what to do. We're better able at identifying when things like loneliness or any sort of mental health issues pop up, where we address them earlier. Whereas, for a lot of people in the early 20s, that's the first time they've ever really experienced it. So, just like with many of these things, the first time you experience it's going to be the roughest. And over time, we absolutely get much, much better. In fact, what you see is even individuals, in older age, you might expect them to be the most lonely. I mean, if you're, elderly, you're more likely to have individuals you love die, family members. But what you tend to see is, in many situations, those individuals they get very, very good at pruning their social networks, keeping the people they want close to them, maintaining it, getting rid of toxic people. So their social support system at some level is very strong, which allows them to cope much better. So yeah, it gets better.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing to share with young people is the feelings you're having today. You'll be able to learn to cope with them much better as you get older. So have the long view. And then as we encounter people who are lonely and stressed, to share those kind of tidbits that to have the long view, and that this is a short-term, maybe a temporary condition, and that you'll work your way out of it. I think put people in that frame of mind.
Yeah, and I think the way that, certainly when I'm struggling with it, or the way I think about it is it's very similar to pain, right? If you stub your toe really, really bad, I mean, everyone agrees that is very painful. Maybe every time I do it, I think I broke my foot or something, right? But that pain subsides. You don't want to get rid of that pain, right? People who have congenital pain insensitivity, they can't feel pain. They actually live miserable lives, right? They might be able to avoid those transient kind of increases in acute pain, but they suffer from a lot of debilitating diseases because that pain isn't there to protect them. And in many ways, we want to think of loneliness as the same, right? Just like when you stub your toe, it's a temporary, an emotional state, just like pain, that's aimed at addressing a problem like stubbing your toe or not being connected with your group. And if you take active coping strategies and don't develop kind of learned helplessness at some level, it will get better. Just like with stubbing your toe, it hurts really bad, but it will get better. With loneliness, it's really fundamentally the same sort of process, the same sort of idea.
So I think that ties really well into the next question, which is, can you delineate for the audience a little bit more the idea about loneliness and depression, how loneliness can become depression? Because what you just said sounded to me like we want to have that stub toe feeling with loneliness, because we'll then know how to react to it and cope with it. But we don't want to fall into a depression. We don't want to medicate from having depression, because it'll numb us to not have that feeling anymore. Maybe you can.
Yeah. So one of the, if we think about what are the, so there, it's not that surprising that there's a very strong connection between high levels of loneliness and depression. And, it's bi-directional, but a lot of research has showed that, it's much stronger in one direction than the other. It's much more likely that an individual that's suffering from very, high levels of loneliness over long periods of time, that's the most likely pathway to develop depression, right? So that's not what I absolutely don't want anyone to think is just because you're lonely, you'll be depressed. Again, that is only happening over very long periods of time. So the way I think of it is that acute loneliness signal is an indicator to utilize some adaptive coping strategies, right? To do something about it. It's only when that problem goes unresolved. It's almost like hunger, right? If you didn't listen to your hunger signal, bad things will happen if you don't eat, right? That hunger signal is there to tell you you're not at kind of that set point and you need to go do something about it to get back to that set point. Loneliness is the same. It only becomes problematic at some level when you ignore it, when you pretend it will go away, when you utilize passive coping strategies. But just like with hunger, if you ignored hunger or thirst, will happen, or pain. Loneliness is the same. We don't have to be afraid of it, because everyone experiences it. It might be uncomfortable, but it's just a signal telling us to do something. about the situation. It only becomes problematic when we act like it's not, when we try to pretend we don't feel it, or we're super strong and we don't feel those sorts of things. Like, that's when it becomes problematic, right? When we address it, acknowledge it, talk about it, deal with it, it's very much the case that it's healthy, right? It keeps us connected with our social groups.
One of our audience members would like to ask whether the frequent use of dating apps can help alleviate loneliness.
That's a loaded question. Well, I mean, I think it matters what the comparison group is. Frequent, it matters what we mean by frequent, right? Is it frequent because you keep getting rejected, or frequent because you're very picky? Those things kind of matter here. But at some level, it's better than doing nothing, right? So if the comparison is using a dating app versus not trying to reach out, absolutely, dating apps are much, much better. But the one thing we want to keep in mind is it's not, I mean, if that, dating app needs to be connected with real kind of connections, right? Just only interacting with people virtually at some level, John Cassioppo, who's my postdoc advisor, who really laid almost all the groundwork for this research, way he described social media and a lot of these sorts of apps that kind of give us the sense that we're connected. It's almost like a social snack or social fast food, right? It gives us that temporary feeling of being full, but it doesn't give us that sustained, at some level, nutrition. So if you're using the dating apps specifically to build real, rich, authentic relationships with people and not just chatting, right? Not just liking their pictures, absolutely. It makes it much easier. I mean, the alternative would be randomly going out and trying to meet people, which is scary, right? So you could easily see a pathway to where, if you use that correctly, if you use it in the kind of more active strategy of connecting with people, not just looking at your screen, it absolutely would be good. But if you're using that as a replacement for that real kind of human connection, it's not better than the real thing.
That's a great answer to that question. Let's talk a little bit about demographics of loneliness. We've had questions about gender differences with loneliness. We've had questions about whether this is a global phenomenon, whether there are differences geographically, by country, by nation, by social or political environments. Would you like to elaborate on that question a little bit?
So the first, I mean, all cultures, all humans that have ever lived and will ever live in the future, they all experience loneliness, right? So we got that out of the gates. There's not subsets of people that don't experience it. Now the different, I mean, so there are subtle differences in things like sex, right? So at least in the States, men tend to be slightly lonelier than women. It's not a huge effect, so you get a lot of mixed results. So you get situations like that. As I mentioned before, there's an effect of age, right? In many cases, that those early 20s, when you're dealing with those sorts of social dynamic stressors for the very first time, that tends to be the most loneliness you experience. And as you get older, and especially into older age, on average, individuals tend to be a little bit less lonely, primarily due to the fact that they're better at kind of creating their social support networks. It's one of those to where it's more research needs to be done on, and I think COVID inspired a lot of this sort of research. Something that is of interest to me is a kind of cultural differences, right? So even though everybody experiences loneliness, it's got to be the case that they experience it in different ways. Just the way the family unit is set up in a place like the United States as compared to maybe Hong Kong or in some places in Europe, right? It's not going to necessarily make some individuals lonely, whereas others wouldn't be, but it's going to change the flavor. It's going to change the pathways through which one is going to become lonely. Some might be more dependent upon peers, right? That might be the primary signal where their loneliness or their feelings of disconnection come from, whereas other cultures that are more focused on the family, you might expect they might have the same amount of loneliness, but the mechanism that gives rise to that loneliness might be more focused on family members or their connection with their larger family unit.
That brings up another interesting question for me, which is, obviously we're sitting in Hong Kong and you're sitting in Chicago. The level of density of a city like Hong Kong and the high population numbers of countries like China and Indonesia, relative to living in the countryside, like, are there differences in loneliness if you're in a highly dense city versus a rural environment?
Well, I think there's yes, there have to be at some level. I think there's a couple things that, I didn't mention too much about. If you remember, what we kind of define loneliness as is not feeling like you have enough social connections of the kind of the high quality to meet that set point. One thing we want to point out is you can have too much, right? and I'm sure we've all experienced this too, where you just are almost overstimulated. You have too many people texting you, too many people asking you to do things, right? It's not just too low. Overcrowding, that sort of overstimulation is also stressful. So getting back to that inverted U idea, too much or too little around that kind of set point drives stress responses. So, social crowding itself can kind of overstimulate individuals, which might make them more motivated to kind of retract, right? So it's not just because you have more people around you, loneliness is less of a problem. As we mentioned before, sometimes being around other individuals you're not connected with when you're lonely can make it worse, right? So, it's kind of a double-edged sword there. So you have, but on the flip side of that, one would think and one would hope, especially moving forward in the future, that higher density populations, and when people kind of, and the governments kind of have a better understanding of the impact that loneliness has, of being able to set up situations or programs or infrastructure that facilitates and makes social connection easier. So you could imagine, high density populations in that case, actually being able to cope better with loneliness should they, should we learn more about how we set that up, because there's just more people to connect around. Kind of living out, outside of the city, kind of more in the rural areas, you could imagine, very comparable situations there, to where it actually might be a little bit harder, right? If there's not a lot of people living around you, you just have less options when it comes to being able to connect physically with people, like going to hang out with them, right? So you would need to adapt coping strategies that kind of fit that. But the important part is, I think here, it's not necessarily that the loneliness is different. It's that these different contexts give rise to different coping strategies being more or less effective, right? So the primary differences in these situations isn't that people are more or less likely to feel lonely. It's they're more or less able to utilize effective coping strategies given their environment.
We touched on a little bit of this next question from an audience member, but I think it has an interesting twist, and that is, why do older people seem to need less connection? And this person has parents who are on the older side, and they don't need a lot of friends. They have each other, but they don't need a lot of friends. He or she is wondering whether this kind of being close at home, but then not having friends outside of the home, is a healthy thing for those parents.
Yeah, I think, this is something, given what we talked about here, this is what makes it a little bit tricky, right? Is what we can't do is make kind of blanket statements about that being good or bad, because one could imagine that story kind of fleshing out to where they're just really good at knowing what their set point is, right? Knowing how many friends they need and the type of quality. And over time, they've just got really good at creating that. So, if you're very efficient at creating that social network, and you have a good idea of what you want and what you don't want, and you're also willing to kind of prune out toxic individuals or relationships that aren't kind of serving their role, what it might look like from the outside is that older individuals just have less friends, right? But probably we could equally describe it as younger individuals have a whole bunch of friends that are kind of not helping the situation, right? Where we have not necessarily pruning, just paying attention to the high quality ones. We're just kind of overwhelmed at some level. So yeah, you could imagine over time, individuals get better at that, more efficient at that, which might make it look like they need less friends or lower, that sort of input, but they're actually getting the same input, just with kind of a more efficient deployment of resources there.
Fascinating. One of our audience members asked whether, I'll rephrase it a bit, whether there's a correlation between heightened drug and alcohol abuse and loneliness.
There absolutely is. Not surprised, stress, and when individuals are feeling very stressed, passive coping strategies that we talked about, right? Drugs of abuse are one of the primary passive coping strategies to try to get ourselves out of that mental state of worrying about it, whether it's through alcohol or drugs, right? So yeah, absolutely. That is something that occurs. It's an example of that passive coping strategy. And we also know, many of the neural mechanisms, unfortunately, I didn't get time to talk about this today, but, I'm not just loosely talking about loneliness and pain there. Many of the neural mechanisms that give rise to the feelings of loneliness share a lot of neural circuitry with the mechanisms that give rise to pain, right? And if we think about drugs of abuse, in many cases, it's not that surprising that the drugs in many of these situations we abuse are ones that kind of turn down the volume of that aversive signal, right? Whether it's physical pain coming from a broken leg, or it might be a kind of psychological pain coming from that social disconnection or breaking up with somebody, or any of those things, to where on an acute time frame for that individual, it might feel like abusing drugs helps with that acute situation. But as we all know, that only kind of contributes to the problem. But yeah, absolutely, there's a very strong connection really between all kind of chronic stress, and especially when people are using maladaptive coping strategies and drug use. It's one of the more common connections there, or stronger connections. Good question.
Maybe one or two last questions from the audience. I think this is an interesting one. I don't know if you have any response to it, but is there a correlation between IQ level of an individual and their ability to cope with loneliness and stress?
So there's a couple. I mean, as a psychologist, I can't help but go, I mean, it's not even clear what IQ is measuring there, but I think I get the point of like just general, we could think of as like the intelligence of the individual. There's quite a bit of work on things like anxiety, showing that individuals who tend to be what we might think of through tests as more intelligent, they are also more likely to suffer from anxiety, right? So at some level, the better your imagination is, and thinking of all the ways things could go poorly, is also the same mechanism that we might use to generate those stress responses. Now, the connection with loneliness is going to be far trickier there, because again, what IQ isn't connected to is like necessarily the number of friends that you require, right? So those are somewhat independent, right? So, which makes that connection between loneliness and something like intelligence a little bit more fuzzy. But what you might imagine is, and this is really general here, is individuals that, if a particular type of intelligence is problem solving, right, they're better at coming up with approaches to deal with an issue, or really that's the same way of talking about active coping strategies. You could imagine individuals with better imaginations, kind of more willingness and better ability to come up with those plans might actually have better coping strategies, which would perhaps lower loneliness. But I'm unaware of a direct connection between something like intelligence and the construct of loneliness itself. But there's plenty of reasons to think they would be connected.
Maybe I'll throw this question at you as the last question. It comes from an audience member again. I'm going to use it as an opportunity to pitch the fact that we have this new podcast that we're going to invite Professor Norman to join, called The Course, where we have our UChicago faculty talk about how they became professors. And that's a good segue to the person's question, which is, they're a high school student and they're interested in kind of reaching your level of expertise in this realm. How long did it take you? What captivated you about this area of study and research, and how long did it take you to get where you're at?
So we were talking about this a little bit earlier. The one thing to keep in mind is everyone that's sitting on this side that wears the uniform of an expert, like all of them had very bumpy roads to get here, right? So the first thing, the kind of funny thing is, I can promise you when I was in high school, I didn't even know what a professor did. I never thought of that. So the fact that you're thinking of that already means you're ahead of the game for me. In high school, I was an athlete. I thought I was it's silly to think of now, I thought I was going to go to the Olympics for track and field. So I got a scholarship to go to undergrad. And fundamentally, most of my undergrad was spent just doing sports and doing the minimum I could in the course room to help me facilitate my sports. Fortunately for me, I got injured, which is a weird thing to think of now. And that really caused me to kind of reevaluate my whole life at the age of, say, 21. And I had to take a step back. And fortunately, being on scholarship allowed me to do this a little bit, and thought about what my interests are. And I mean, so I'm, 21, 22 years old, don't even know what a PhD stands for. And I just went on, I've always been interested in how people respond to stress and, the stress of competition, or how people motivate themselves. So that was all I needed. I just went to the psychology website at Ohio State and just went down the list alphabetically and emailed people. Robert Arkin was the first lab I worked in because his last name started with an A. Gary Bernstein was one of the next labs I worked in because his name started with a B. And working in those labs made me particularly, kind of facilitated my interests and really got me focused on this idea of why is the social environment seeming to be the cause of so much of our stress. So, if I would have sent a different email on a different day, who knows where I would be.
That's great. So we're going to have you on The Course, and I can't wait to share that episode with anybody that's either on this program or that wants to listen to your journey. Can you just finally tell us what you're working on now specifically? Do you have multiple research projects going on?
Yeah. So I mean, generally speaking, what my lab studies is how the different sorts of stressors that we might experience, individual differences in how we experience them, and then how do we respond to them, much like what we were talking about today. So some of the research that is currently ongoing is looking at the impact of something like loneliness. How does loneliness change our memory for a social stressor, right? So if you come into a task feeling particularly lonely, are you more likely to remember the negative aspects of being socially rejected and kind of forget the positive aspects? Does that memory kind of change over time as a function of mood state? So those studies kind of looking at those kind of steps and the mechanisms that might give rise to the sorts of impacts that we talked about today. I'm also a lot of my interest is in looking out into the real world, finding individuals that experience what we can all agree is a whole lot of stress, whether that's in the military or going through traumatic situations, and trying to better understand, for the most part, how is it the case that most individuals that go through these, from the outside, what look like massive traumatic events, many of those individuals, they cope with it. I mean, it's not necessarily something that's good for them, but how are we so good and so flexible at coping with these different sorts of stressors in our life? And what are the different sorts of pathways or the different sorts of dynamics that come into play with maybe it's self-esteem or something like loneliness or grit or motivation, trying to better understand why is it that we respond to stressors in such, at some level, it looks from the outside like unpredictable ways, or at least unintuitive ways. So yeah, most of my research is really kind of looking at those factors, whether it's in young kids or older adults, pretty much anywhere where you can find stressful people, I'm interested in studying them.
Fantastic. Professor Norman, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with the audience tonight. I actually can't wait to have you back on a program to talk about other topics related to this subject, and also have you in Hong Kong to meet with our community here. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Talk soon.
Okay, take care. And yeah, so mental health and well-being is definitely an important topic for everyone. I hope the audience gained more insights into these concepts of being alone and loneliness, and have found effective solutions needed to deal with these important issues, especially during this period of time. We have a brief poll for you tonight on this program, that for those of you that are watching on Zoom. And if you're watching live via Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your answers in the comments below. While you complete the survey, I just want to tell you a little bit more about our program next week, which will be the second episode of Veblen's World of Luxury, the mini-series called Asia's Booming Luxury Market. We'll continue our discussion on Veblen's theory of conspicuous consumption in the luxury goods area, as well as new insights into inconspicuous consumption. We had a dry run for that program today, and I was fascinated by our speakers. I think you'll really enjoy it. I'm excited about next week's program and our panel of experts, and we hope you can join us next week. So please have a great long weekend here in Hong Kong, and have a wonderful evening or day wherever you may be. Good night.